Hello, everyone. Welcome to our February 2025 tips and tricks session. This month, we're looking at longitudinal projects. So this is one of the first ones that was requested specifically by a user wanting more details about how longitudinal projects work and the advantages and disadvantages that they provide. So what is a longitudinal project in REDCap? The deal with longitudinal projects is that they're split into multiple events and possibly multiple arms. So you can think of events like folders that exist within a record, and then arms are like folders that records exist within. So you can create multiple arms that have their own structures of events, and then you assign different forms to each event. You can assign the same form to multiple events, and that's one of the big advantages is that you can save significant labor on study builds by reusing the same form in multiple events. And then when you build a longitudinal study like this, both your data entry and your stored and exported data will be organized based on the events arms. So that's the events and arms are a key aspect of how REDCap organizes and maintains that data. So you'll see later that that has an impact on what your data looks like when it's reporting and exporting time. So let's look at a project. I've started a project in REDCap that has some forms to it. So you can see in here, I've got a patient demographics form. I'll explain about the visit information form in a minute here. I've got a labs form, treatment, medical history, adverse events, and medication. So these are the forms that I'm working with for this project. So I've built my forms out. And we've done step one. You go to project setup, and that's where you can enable using the longitudinal data collection. So here's that button. And when we choose to enable longitudinal data collection with defined events, that's when we get this new box down here for defining my events and designating instruments for my events. So when I come into define my events, it starts me off with just event one, arm one. That's my only event. I only have one arm. And I get to start naming my events. So we'll have a screening event in arm one, and we'll have their month one visit, month two, month three, and an end of study visit. So I can set up another arm that has a different events schedule. So let's say got arm two. You can actually custom name the arms. So I can say, I'm just going to call it arm two, but you can custom name them. And then you get to add events for this arm. So I can add a screening visit for this arm. If I wanted to do my screening visits before I sort people into arms, I would actually make a screening visit under arm one and nothing else under arm one. I would put everything else under arm two and arm three, and those would be my main study visits. And I would create a patient ID field that I use to track people across these different arms. Because once people are in an arm, that's where their record lives. So that's something to think about, is that if you screen and then randomize and the arms are broken up based on randomization, you might need to split the screening out from your two arms, or you can randomize and have everything live in a longitudinal project that just has one arm and the separate events. That's also an option you have. There's a lot of flexibility here. So I can build different schedules for my two different arms, is the point that I was about to make. So in arm one, I'm seeing people every month, but we're going to say arm two, I'm monitoring a little more closely, and I'm seeing people every 2 weeks. So I'm adding these visits for week 2, 4, 6, 8, week 10, week 12, and then they have their end of study visit. So that's something that I can do. I can have different schedules in my different arms. This is part of the value of splitting into multiple arms, whereas part of the value of staying within one arm but creating a longitudinal project is that I can screen everybody and put them in their conditions, but they all just go forward within one arm. I don't have to worry about tracking across multiple arms and deciding which arm to put people in before I input their data, or keeping a separate screening arm and then putting them into the correct arm once they're randomized. So that's setting up the events themselves. You can add new events throughout the life of a project. You can't delete events. Once a project goes into production, doing things like deleting events will cause data to be lost. So you can't do that. Then you can set up instruments within your events and arms. So it's giving us this lovely pop-up here saying, don't forget to designate your instruments. And this is the fun part and where you can see the labor saving. So I'm going to begin editing in arm one. So I have my patient demographics, visit information, labs treatment. Okay, so I'm going to say that at screening, I do my patient demographics. I fill out my visit information form, which I'll explain later. We collect labs, we do their first treatment. So everybody gets a visit information form. Let's say that I'm doing labs at all of my visits too. And then we're doing treatment at everything but end of study. So this would mean a lot of separate forms. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 14. That would have to be 14 separate forms if I wanted all of that to live in my designer. Or I can use a longitudinal project and just designate the same form to multiple different events. So that's the big labor save. And here where we've got that weekly schedule, that would be even more of a pain to do in the designer, but I can just come right in here, designate my forms, and it costs me so little extra work. You're getting treatment and all of these, just not end of study. All right. So the other important thing, again, once a project goes into production, if you undesignate a form from an event, that results in data loss for that form at that event. So the event coding is a key part of how that data is kept track of. Removing the form from the event means that that data gets lost. So only admins can do it, and it's not advised to do at all. The advice is to use form display logic to hide a form instead of undesignating it. So to use form display logic, and this is covered in more detail in our video on hiding items in REDCap, but you would use form display logic. You would create a condition that is false, and you would select the forms that you want to hide. And you could choose to keep forms enabled if they contain data. And that's how you hide a form without losing any of the associated data. Because undesignating will cause your data to be lost. So some tips for how I typically build my longitudinal projects. Visit dates, both for the visits as they happen and for the visit that's coming up, are really, really useful when I go to schedule alerts or when I go to revise a project. So I will typically, that's what's up with my visit information form. So if I click into my visit information form, I'm checking, did the visit take place? Because the other thing that I want to do as I'm tracking data collections, I want to know the difference between, hey, this visit didn't take place, or this measurement wasn't collected, versus it's just blank and I don't know what happened to that data. So I want to have documentation of both what did happen and what didn't happen. But then I've got, you see, I've got a visit date, and I've got here on that same form when their next visit is scheduled. Because I have found that if I make people go under the next visit to mark the date that it was scheduled for, they forget a lot. But if I have it live on the same form that they're already filling out for stuff at this visit, they're a lot more likely to document that information, and then I can use that scheduled visit date to send an alert about their upcoming visit. So I can send reminder emails to my coordinator and to my patients. That's why I have the scheduled visit date living here. And then there are things that happen at the visits, like reviewing medical history and reviewing changing or new adverse events. So let's say I don't see anything new added to my adverse event log after a new visit. Is that because there were no adverse events, or did we forget to check? That's why I have the options that I have here that yes, we did have new stuff, see it on the adverse event log. There are no changes to report, but I did actually check. And then, oops, no, we forgot to check. As much as possible, I will build standardized forms and then designate them to multiple events like we just saw in the designer. So for small differences, you can use branching logic that's based on the events, the names of the events. So let's say I go back into my visit information form, and let's look at those last two questions there, where I've got their medical history review, and I've got adverse event review. So in a lot of studies that I've worked on, medical history gets reviewed at the very beginning, and then you document it, and then you're done. Everything that happens after that screening point isn't their medical history anymore. It's adverse events that happen during the life of the study. So I would want to have a little bit of a difference between how this form shows up at screening and how it shows up at all the follow-up visits, where they only see the medical history question at screening and they only see the adverse events question at the follow-up visits. So let's come into my branching logic for their medical history review. And I'm able to use these smart variables. So smart variables are variables that tell REDCap to check certain information about the event that you're under, the user you're under. There's a ton of smart variables. They're a really useful tool. You can have calendar ones, form-related ones, survey-related ones. They're really helpful. But in a longitudinal project, we had some special ones related to event and then also arm. So the one that I'm going to use in my branching logic here is event name. Because what I want to do is I want to show this only for screening. So I'm going to say that we're showing this if event name equals. So I'm going to briefly put a square bracket so that I can see my names. Okay, it's screening underscore arm underscore 1, and then screening underscore arm underscore 2. Okay. But I'm not going to have that bracket. So if I write with square brackets, I'm telling REDCap, go check this variable. But what I want to tell REDCap right now is, okay, go check the event name variable. But then I want you to compare it to another string of text. I want you to see if it matches this text value I'm giving you. And the text values I'm giving it are screening arm 1 and screening arm 2. But in order for REDCap to know, hey, this is a text value you're supposed to compare to, instead of this is another variable you're supposed to go fiddle with, I need to put it in these quotes instead of in the square brackets. So the square bracket will pull up all my fields so I can just look at them quick. But the way that I actually want this listed in my events or in my branching logic is in those quotation marks. So REDCap knows that it's comparing the contents of the event name variable to my text string screening arm 2 or screening arm 1. Then I'm going to copy this actually. So that's my branching logic for the medical history review, because that only happens at screening. So now I come into the logic for my AE review question. And I want this one to show up at every visit except screening. That's a lot of visits to write. So instead of writing out all of those different event names, I'm going to be lazy. So what I'm writing right now is event name does not equal screening arm 1. And the event name does not equal screening arm 2. So what this means is if my event name is screening arm 1, cool, we failed the does not equal screening arm 1 condition, this field doesn't show. If my event name equals screening arm 2, we failed this condition, this box will not show up. If I have anything else as my event name besides screening arm 1 or screening arm 2, I'm getting this field. And so we can come into our record status dashboard and let's go add a test record. In my personal grand tradition, we will name this one Bilbo Baggins. /10/1933 for a birth date, consent date today. We've got his demographics, and let's look at his visit information. So for his screening visit, I can see that medical history question shows up, but my adverse events question doesn't. And then if I come under month 1, my adverse events question shows up, but my medical history question doesn't. So that's how you use that event-related branching logic.
Now, when I have bigger differences between events, like let's say I'm collecting specialized labs at certain events, I find that it's easier for me build wise, and it's easier for the people reading my records if I actually create separate forms for those different lab collections.
So I'm going to take my existing labs form, and this is going to become my comprehensive metabolic panel. You can see on here, I've got glucose, bun, creatinine, EGFR, sodium, potassium. I've got alkaline phosphatase, things like that. D-dimer is a coagulation lab. So I'm actually going to take this one off of here. It's going to live with my other coagulation labs in a new form. So we're going to move this field to my newly created instrument. That option lives down at the bottom of that menu. All right. And we're going to go to our new instrument. So I'm going to come back out to my designer. This new instrument is going to be my coagulation labs. So I'm gonna move that up to live right here next to my comprehensive metabolic panel. And we're gonna have a PT, and I don't remember units or ranges for any of these, so we're just gonna not worry about those parts. PTT and INR. So those are my coagulation labs now, PT, PTT, INR, and D-dimer. And they live separately from my metabolic panel. And the reason I want to do this, so because they live on separate forms now, I can designate them to different events. So I can say that, okay, we're doing the comprehensive metabolic panel at every visit, but we're only doing the coagulation labs at the beginning, month 2, and end of study. And those can have separate logic to them. So now when I come under the record status dashboard, and it's easier to see if I click into Bilbo's record, you can see it shows me right as I pull up his record, okay, I need to order a comprehensive metabolic panel at every visit, and only these visits I need to order the coagulation labs. So it acts as a really helpful reminder for the people doing these study visits. Forms can also be repeated on a per event basis. So let's say that I'm going to now create a new ECG form. So we're going to start collecting ECGs too. And this is going to be one that gets repeated at one visit and not another. So heart rate and QRS. All right, so I have an ECG form. So I can come under project setup and designate it to multiple visits. So we're going to say I'm getting my ECGs at screening, month 2, and end of study. But when I go back and I look at my imaginary protocol for this project, at the screening visit, I actually want 3 ECGs. I want to take it multiple times. So the way that I can accommodate that, I can come under project setup. I can enable repeating instruments. And now you see where I have the repeating instrument options, it's broken out based on my events. So I don't have to make my ECG repeating for every event, because there are a lot where I only want that one ECG recording, but I can make it repeating just for my screening event. And so if I come in And I don't know for sure what the normal range for QRS is, so bear with me there. You can see under screening, I get this plus sign to add more ECGs at screening, whereas when I fill it out at month 2, I don't get that plus sign because at month 2, it's not repeated. So you have that flexibility as well. The other interesting thing about building longitudinal projects is that some types of information are collected continuously and not anchored to a specific time point. So if we look at the data collection instruments that I have designated, right, I collect patient demographics once. This visit information refers to a specific visit. The ECG refers to ECGs that I collect at specific visits. The labs refer to labs that I collect at specific visits. But other things don't work quite the same way. So let's think about somebody's adverse events or their medical history, the medications that they take throughout the life of a study. Those don't live under a single event. They're happening continuously. So if I have someone break their leg right after they leave for their 1 month visit, or right after they leave from their 1 month visit, and I find out about it at month 2, which event do I put it under? I don't want to deal with that. I want to see my continuous events living separate from my time point events. So what I'll do is I'll build another event called study logs, or sometimes I'll build an event for each continuous item. Like I'll have an adverse events event, a medication event, medical history event. Today, we're just going to build a study logs, and that's where all of my continuous forms are going to live. So I'm going to come in here to define my events, and I'm only worrying about arm 1 now. And we're going to add a new event called study logs. I like to put this up near my screening event because that's really when we start collecting the study logs. And I want them to be kind of front and center. If my list of events gets too long, people might have to scroll to the end to see that they've got these continuous forms. I want them front and center. So we create my study logs event, designate instruments for it. And here's where my medical history, adverse events, and medications are going to live. And then I'm going to pop under project setup real quick because all of these are also repeating forms. So under my study logs event, I'm going to let them independently repeat medical history, adverse events, and medications. So we can capture as many of each of those as the person has, and we don't need to worry about which time point to assign them to. They're all being collected continuously. So in longitudinal projects, interesting things start to happen because of that event organization. All of your data lives under certain events, and REDCap goes to look under the event that either you're on currently or the event you tell it to look under in order to figure out what information you're trying to tell it. So when I'm building branching logic in a longitudinal project, if I branch just the way that I would in any other project, its default is to look under the current project. So let's say that I want to branch for my visit information form. I want to start branching lab forms based on whether I say yes or no to did this person do the visit. So as an example of that, we're only going to do the glucose field, but I would come in and say that visit equals the visit YN field equals 1, save that. So now if I hop into my example record here and I say, yes, this visit took place, you can come see on my metabolic panel now, I have my glucose field. Whereas if I come into month 3 and say, no, this visit didn't take place, then the month 3 glucose field, notice this one starts with bun, my glucose field is gone. So the default is for REDCap to look under the same event. But interesting things start to happen when we want information that is recorded under one event to affect what we see for a different event. So let's say that I had a protocol change. This is a very common situation. I had a protocol change. So people who consented after February 15th are, we stopped collecting the D-dimer. So this is going to involve doing a date diff. And we have details about the date diff function and common things that go wrong with it in our branching logic video. All right, so this is my base branching logic for this field. So this is saying that if February 15th minus my consent date is a positive value, so positive value means that my consent date happened before February 15th, then I will show my D-dimer field. But after that, my D-dimer field will not appear. So that's my base branching logic. But let's think about this. My D-dimer field doesn't always live under the same visit as my consent date. The consent date only lives under the screening event. So I need to tell REDCap to go look under screening arm 1 to find my consent date information for the other events. So if I come into my record status dashboard, all right, let's set this person's consent date as 2/13. Save and exit. Then we go look at our coagulation labs. So we're showing the D-dimer field. And when we come under month 2 here, that's the wrong form, but we're still showing the D-dimer field. So let's change the consent date now. Let's change that to today, which is 2/20. And then, so what I'm looking for is that now this person had their consent date on 2/20. So even though that consent date doesn't live under here, I still want it to affect my month 2 coagulation labs form. And now it's happening. My D-dimer field is hidden. Very commonly, people will have a field that they've done branching logic on and it's still showing. And it's because it's branched based on a separate event, and you got to specify which event REDCap should go look under to find out whether to display your field at that later event. In a project that's in production where you're not opening all the designer forms, for easy reference, you can find both your field names and all of your event names and which forms are assigned to which events. That all lives here under the codebook. So you've got easy access to that if you need to build branching logic in a study that's already in production. When you're building alerts in a longitudinal project, so let's say I want to send a reminder for my month 1 visit. So I want to send this if I have information about my next visit date, but I have a next visit date field for every event. And for my month 1 visit, what I actually care about is the next visit date that got documented under my screening visit. So for my month 1 visit, I want to look at whether I've got my next visit date for screening. And then I want to send this also before that scheduled visit date that's documented under screening. But then down here, I'll be talking about their month 1 visit reminder. So if you have, again, if things live under different visits, it's very helpful to be specifying which visit you're looking at for which type of information. The other thing is that the emails, right, for my subject, they actually get documented under the screening event. So I don't want to try to pull, if I'm looking at a later event, let's say that I write a reminder that's based on the contents of month 3. I don't want it to try to look under month 3 for their email. I want it to look under screening for their email address, because that's where that data actually lives. So that's another thing where we will often see alerts not sending because we didn't tell REDCap which event it needs to go look under to see the participant's email address. And like I mentioned earlier, those smart variables, those can be accessed with that green smart variables button, which shows up here. It shows up in the designer, and you can find information about different event related smart tags or smart variables. So you can get information about the next event or previous event's name and label, first or last event. You can also pipe those labels and names in, as well as the ones for a current event. Another neat thing that shows up when we start working with longitudinal projects is this thing called the scheduling module. So all REDCap projects already have this calendar. The calendar is part of the REDCap project, and it lets you track dates kind of related to the project. So let's say, I have a monitoring visit next Wednesday. I can put on the calendar monitoring visit, and I can choose whether to associate things with a record or not. This is a general situation, so I'm not associating that with a record. And I can schedule on here specific participant related events by hand. A cool thing I can do if I enable the scheduling module is I can generate those schedules based on my timeline and schedule people's visits all at once and make sure that they're within my study windows. So the way that I do that, I come enable my scheduling module. And now when I go back into define my events, I have some new columns. I have days offset and offset range. So days offset, we're measuring from whatever our 0 point is in the study. So think of the 0 point where your protocol is telling you to measure these visits from. So sometimes you're measuring 1 month after visit. So is month one after the screening? Is it 1 month after the day I start treatment? Because those could be different days depending on the structure of my study. Let's say I have a screening visit and then a treatment 1 visit, and those are separate visits. Which one am I measuring my follow-ups based on? So that's how I set my offset days. If I have something that happens before my first visit, I'll just give it a negative offset. But we're going to say screening gets to be my 0 point, and study logs will also have an offset of 0 because I start them from that same time point, that beginning of the study. And then month 1, I'm going to say that that's 30 days, but I have 7 days in either direction to schedule it. So I have a little bit of that wiggle room allowance, and that -7 +7, that's how I'm measuring that. And that's how REDCap is knowing that I have those time ranges. Oop, I already did study logs. Month 2 is 60 days ±7. And then month 3 is 90 days ±7. And then we're going to say my end of study happens at the 4-month mark. So that's going to be 120 days ±7. So now I've got, and REDCap will order these things based on my day's offset. That's the other reason I gave study logs an offset of 0 so that it is right next to the screening visit. Gives them those offset days and their offset ranges. And now I've got this new tab on my left sidebar. I've got scheduling. And if I click into these, so I can either generate a new record with a given start date. So I can say I'm going to generate record 2 in arm 1, and I'm going to give it a start date of 2/27. I can also generate a schedule for an existing visit or an existing patient, or I can come in and use this tab to edit an existing schedule. So you do have the ability to change these visits after you've set up your original schedule. We're going to start generating our schedule here. And this gives me a lot of information. So it tries to auto schedule things exactly at that offset. So this is exactly 30 days after 2/27. This is exactly 60, 90, 120 days. But it also gives me my allowable ranges. So I can schedule this one as early as 3:22 or as late as 4:05. The other really nice thing it does is it flags weekend days for me. So this is setting it for a Saturday. My exactly 30 days would be a Saturday. I don't want to schedule a patient on a Saturday. No one's going to be at the clinic. We're going to schedule that for 3:27 instead. And I can make any modifications that I want to make. Let's say they're going to be out of town the week of 6:27. So, okay, we're going to look into the next week and I'm going to schedule them for 6:30. And you can see that's still falling within my ranges. If I try to schedule them out of range, um, it gives me this little pop-up, hey, this is an out of range date. You may wish to modify it so it's within the suggested range. Oh, yeah. Okay, let's set them for 6:4. All right, so now I can create their schedule. And this goes onto my calendar. It's been added to the calendar. It also gives me this handy little printout that I can print for my patient. I can just hand them that calendar. And if there are changes down the road, we can come edit the schedule for our patient too. Let's say that they found out, oh, my aunt's birthday is on 3:27. I'm gonna have plans. Okay, well, let's see you in the office on 3:26 instead. And it lets us adjust either all dates to change, back one day or just adjust this one. So I'm gonna just adjust this one. It also lets me add a new calendar event on an ad hoc basis, like let's say that someone had an emergency additional infusion of their drug or something. That's something that I might want to print on my schedule. But I can print them a new schedule. And if I come into my calendar tab here, we can see that I've now got, okay, their screening and study logs are on February 27th. Their month one visit is March 26th, and it tells me which record I'm looking at. So I'm looking at record 2 for their month one visit. It also lets me sync the calendar to an external application. So I can either download an ICS file for a one-time import. But the other cool thing is that I can link this calendar live to my Outlook calendar. So I can copy the URL to my clipboard, and I can come into Outlook. And here where it says other calendars, I can add a calendar from the internet. And I can sync those calendars. So now I can get this new external calendar to display within my Outlook calendar. So this will be a special calendar just for my study, but it does sync with my Outlook calendar. And I can have that sync live so that as I change things within my project, if someone reschedules their visit date, it'll get changed on my Outlook calendar too. So reports and data exports, this is where people often are making their ultimate pro-con decision about the longitudinal studies. Because everything that I've said so far has been essentially in favor of longitudinal studies. They make so many of the logistics so much smoother and easier. They save you so much labor on the setup, especially if you need to take the same measures over and over and over again at different visits. But people do have different opinions and different needs regarding the data that they actually see and the way that that's organized. So the way that data is organized in a longitudinal study, I'm actually going to come into a different project because this shows it really, really well. I have more test records entered. So under data exports, reports, and stats, if I view all my data for this one, here's what's going on. So I have for each event, I get a new row. And if I repeat an instrument, each repeat of an instrument gets a new row as well. So that means that technically my data about who this person is, let's say what cancer type he has, lives on a different row than his lab values. And so this organization some people find it very useful and intuitive, some people don't. So I can filter down to certain events, certain criteria to get something that's easy to visualize in REDCap. Um, and again, if you're filtering based on a field, you're going to want to specify which event that field is living under. So let's say that I wanted to create a report here where I'm only seeing people who have their primary cancer site listed as stomach. I need to specify that I'm collecting that at my baseline event. I can say for all events, but for things that are repeated across the study, let's say that I was filtering. So this is their primary disease site, which I only collect once. But let's say that I want to see their treatment outcomes for patients where I had a glucose greater than 100. Which glucose do I care about? Do I care that they had that glucose at baseline? Do I care that they had that glucose at the end of the study? Do I care that they had it throughout the entire life of the study?
Do I need patients whose glucose was elevated the entire study? So then I would need people who've had their glucose over 100 at the screening visit.
And glucose was greater than 100 at month 1. And glucose was greater than 100 at month 2. So if I need glucose to have been greater than 100 at every single visit, I need this series of and conditions to filter in only people who had it consistently elevated, versus if I just need it to be elevated at a certain visit. If I need it to have been elevated ever, I can select all events. So that's a key part of your filtering logic with a longitudinal project, is you need to think through the events aspect of your filter. Most analysis packages that work with longitudinal data, like LME4 in R, they do like having a new event on each row, a new repeat on each row. That works really well for those. But if the way that you want to see your data involves seeing, let's say, your demographics and your labs on the same form, you're going to need, or on the same row for each person, you're going to need to export that data and use some joins. Or do some copy and pasting in Excel. We recommend using one of the analysis softwares to save yourself a lot of time and grief once you have a lot of patients, but you'll need to clean your data in order to see certain things. So you might have a greater need to take things out of REDCap, or you might need to create a lot of filtered reports to see the data that you want to see live throughout the life of the study. Versus if I have a project where I just have the same variables collected at multiple visits, but I've built it in a non-longitudinal fashion. So for this one, you can see I'm copying my visit information form. So I'll still build a template form because this saves me grief. Visit information form month 3, but I'll make multiple copies of it in the designer. And when I do that, these are all separate variables. So my visit date for month 1, you can see is VT date M1. So if I go to look under my data report, all of these are actually separate fields and they live across the same row, just with different variable names. So you can see my visit dates for month 1 and month 2, they're on the same row and they just have slightly different variable names. So that is the alternative to doing a longitudinal project if you really want to have one row per patient. And like I was showing you with making multiple copies of the same template form, you can save yourself some grief with that process. Um, and that's an option that you have. But some of the other aspects of longitudinal projects, like being able to do that calendar trick, and easily adding, all the forms that you need for a new event versus having to go form by form and make a copy and make sure that all my branching logic reflects things correctly. Like that's going to be quite different. So, and when I want to do alerts and branching logic, I'll just have to make sure that I grab the right variable name instead of specifying by this generalized variable and then which event to go look under. So those are the trade-offs with longitudinal projects, is that your data is going to display a certain way. If you want it in a different format, you'll have to export. But that's our presentation on longitudinal projects and their values and their trade-offs and how to work with them. Thank you so much for joining us and have a wonderful day.